It's my great honor to introduce to you a person who is, to me, an absolute hero of Afrofuturism, and that's Rasheedah Phillips. She's here today to discuss community-driven documentation, cultural memory, and conceptions of time, and to inspire us about the potential of digital libraries to support and be shaped by marginalized people's work to imagine alternate futures. So in that, Rasheedah will draw on her practical perspectives and her experiences as a public interest attorney and activist who works against the forces of gentrification and eminent domain in North Philadelphia. She'll draw on her conceptual projects as an artist, science fiction writer, and co-founder of a community center designed around principles of Black quantum futurism. Rasheedah is oh, I'm not done yet, honey. Rasheedah is a 2008 graduate of Temple University's Beasley School of Law. She serves as managing attorney for the housing unit at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, and she's creative director of an arts-based grassroots organization called the Afrofuturist Affair, which she founded in 2011. As part of the Black Quantum Futurism Collective, she collaborated with the musical and performance artist Moore Mother, who's blowing up lately, to found and direct the Community Futures Lab. Rasheedah and her partner described the lab as a community gallery, resource and zine library, a workshop space, a recording booth, and a time capsule for recording oral histories and futures in North Philly. She's also the author, among other works, of the future entry in a book that I love, which is called Keywords for Radicals, The Contested Vocabulary of Late Capitalist Struggle. She serves on the board of directors of the Friends of the Free Library of Philadelphia, and most recently won the 2017 Housing Justice Award from the National Housing Law Project. Her talk for us today is entitled, Creating Communal Time Spaces, Activating Quantum Time Capsules. So please join me in welcoming Rasheedah Phillips.
Good morning, everyone. So many of you. Nice to see all your faces. Thank you very much for your introduction. I'm very honored to be here and to have the opportunity to speak to you all today. So I'm going to play a couple of slides. Some of them may be a little bit out of order. So when you think about the future, near or far, what imagery comes to mind? Do you picture spaceships, robots, genetic engineering maybe? If popular speculative media, literature, and film are any indication, and these days even in regular news media, the images that people draw to mind when envisioning the future generally include post-apocalyptic landscapes, advanced technology, and space or time travel. Glaringly absent from these visions of the future, however, are representations of diverse cultures and complicated intersectional identities. Although traditional science fiction has been able to successfully conceive of novel technologies and entire new species and universes, it has on the whole failed to transcend the oppressive conditions and social hierarchies that are etched into our present-day realities. Science fiction is not the only realm in which the future has been taken for granted. I believe we all take the future for granted, and we do this because we encounter the future daily, if not moment to moment. Whether it's in an ad promotion, in a song, or just in casual conversation about what we're about to do next. The future is ever present, both mundane and cosmic, on the matter of scale. But again, rarely do we think of where the future is, who has access to it, and whether we are all accelerating at the same rate and pace into that future. We almost never think about how gender, race, income shifts the means of access to the future. I myself have been thinking about shifting, creating, and negotiating my future in various ways since I was a young child. I was born and grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, a very small city with a largely Black population affected by poverty, segregation, violence, and educational inequality, much like Philadelphia, where I live now, and not unlike places like Ferguson or Flint. For me, reading and writing science fiction were not only a means of escape, but in many ways it was a means of survival, a way of envisioning futures for myself outside of the limited options presented by me and by my environment, in my environment. My very first stories, penciled onto the fronts and backs of big gray handwriting lined paper during recess, told twisted tales of little girls waking up as Barbie dolls on Christmas and aliens who were secretly disguised as parents and teachers. I was born to a young mother. My mother had me at the age of 14, and her mother had her at the age of 17. Despite my own mother's conscious efforts to lift us out of poverty and to shift our family cycle, I still ended up becoming a part of that cycle. I became pregnant at the age of 14. During my pregnancy and for several months after giving birth to my child, I became extremely discouraged by the stigma of being a young mother. I was on the verge of dropping out of high school, though I had always been a good student prior to getting pregnant. This vision of my future as a teen parent dropout was inscribed and reinscribed by many of my high school teachers and other adults in my life. I had people telling me that I wouldn't make it past 9th grade and that college wouldn't be a possibility. For a long time, I internalized that future for myself, and I nearly gave up on high school. After a difficult, high-risk pregnancy where I had to miss several months of school, my grades dropped, and I became severely depressed, almost unable to take care of my premature newborn child. In large part, what put me back on track, what allowed me to return to school the next year and work extremely hard to get my grades back up, was looking at my child and wanting a different future for them, wanting to expand their options beyond those that I have been presented with. I felt that I owed it to my child to shift that family cycle. With a change in high schools and additional support from my mother, counselors, and caring people who recognized that I still had potential despite my circumstances, I managed to graduate high school with honors and decided to pursue a degree in law. Prior to entering Temple University's Beasley School of Law as a first-year law student in 2005, my views on my career options as an attorney were relatively narrow. Motivated in part by the inequalities and miscarriages of justice that I witnessed growing up in a poor neighborhood, and in part by my own experiences as a young mother, I applied to law school with the goal of becoming a prosecutor. At the time of forming that goal, and even upon entering law school, I believed that my only viable career options were to become a personal injury lawyer, a corporate lawyer, or a criminal lawyer. The belief in this limited range of options as an attorney had been cultivated by years of law and order and personal experience of family members touched by the justice system. After I entered law school and began to take classes, it eventually occurred to me that my decision to pursue a career as a prosecutor would no longer resonate with my goals, nor was it the type of work that would allow me to effectively address the issues of poverty, gender, and race as they intersected with the law. And to be honest, during undergrad, I changed my mind so many times about pursuing this career and its ultimate utility. My experiences in college helped me to develop my sense of cultural identity and agency. As an undergrad at Temple, I took classes that splintered open my consciousness around the complexity of Black identity and its multifaceted existence across racial, cultural, gender, social, and institutional lines. My college courses reshaped my perspective on the world, forcing me to take a more critical approach to how I viewed the experiences of Black women and the Black community and its portrayal in broader culture and society. I spent the first semester of law school wondering if I made the wrong decision. I had not adequately prepared myself for how different the experience would be from my undergraduate education, and I admittedly experienced a sense of culture shock in such an unfamiliar, rigorous, and highly competitive academic environment. For many reasons, I did not fit in with my day program classmates. It also did not help that I looked so different from all of my other law school classmates as a young mother and as one of few Black students. There were policies that were prohibitive, such as not being able to work the first year of law school, which was reasonable given a workload, but financially challenging for me as a single mother with a young child. I was dubbed the non-traditional law student by some professors, while others made remarks like, "I didn't think you could write this well because, well, you know." Hurricane Katrina had just happened, and I was also completely devastated, especially after having been in New Orleans just months before celebrating my graduation from undergrad with friends. With rigid first-year courses and a style of engagement that was completely foreign to me, I became very depressed and on the verge of dropping out in my first few months in my first year of law school. It was during my second semester that a chance encounter with a public interest attorney introduced me to the concept of public interest lawyering. And it was in this context that everything I was learning in law school took on a new meaning and could be applied with renewed value. From that point forward, I knew that I wanted to be a legal services attorney, and I immediately began to gear the remainder of my law school career toward this end goal. But more than that, becoming a part of the public interest community allowed me to recognize how deeply connected legal services work is to my own life experiences growing up as a poor young Black mother, and the experiences of families, neighbors, and communities in ways that went way beyond just contact with the criminal justice system. Currently, I am managing attorney in the housing unit at Community Legal Services, where I assist low-income tenants living in private and subsidized housing on issues of repairs, eviction, disability, illegal evictions, and survivors of domestic violence seeking transfers into safer housing. In this work, I not only have the opportunity to represent clients directly, but I also engage in local, state, and national policy advocacy to improve access to safe and affordable housing for low-income tenants. Realizing the ways in which my life experiences have come full circle for me brings a certain amount of charm to my work. It's what allows me to consider my work as a form of time travel and to see time as more cyclical than linear, to know that I'm always in contact with my humble beginnings, and that those beginnings shape and strengthen the relationship that I have to my own work, with clear visions of the future that I want to help build and be a part of. It took me many years to give myself permission to be creative with my work as an attorney, in a way that I think about my work and to not silo or compartmentalize it from my artistic and Afrofuturistic cultural work. I think my career suffers from taking itself too seriously. It took me a long time to see the positive in being considered the non-traditional person. Tradition isn't always good or sensible. It took me a long time to understand how creative thinking and creative interests could benefit me in my own profession. So, not long after I graduated from law school, I started taking creative writing classes at the local community college and would visit sci-fi conventions and meetings. In those spaces, I soon became reminded of my feelings of frustration with the sci-fi genre, and my frustrations with being the only Black girl in a room who liked sci-fi, or not being able to find books and resources that reflected my social identities as a queer Black woman or as a single mother. Those experiences led me to create my own community of writers and to find support for publishing my own first book of speculative fiction work. In 2011, I created the Afrofuturist Affair, which is a grassroots organization dedicated to celebrating and promoting Afrofuturistic culture, art, and literature through creative events and creative writing. In 2012, I became the founding member of Metro Polarity, a queer speculative fiction collective, and co-created Black Quantum Futurism with my partner in 2014. I created and helped create these spaces because I needed to be a part of a community of creative people who were actively engaging what the future can look like for those who have been marginalized and oppressed, and not just as a mere reinforcement or evolution of the same social structures that we continue to be oppressed by in the present. And from this standpoint, you can engage the speculative future from the imagination of Octavia Butler, envision the future formed from the liberation policies of Marcus Garvey, or even disrupt the structures of systemic racism, law, and social policy through the short science fiction stories of late civil rights attorney Derek Bell. The power of speculation, futurism, and envisioning something different and better for oneself should be accessible to anyone. The ability to create the future you want to live in, the ability to interact with your past and history to create better versions of the future for yourself and your community should belong to all of us. Speculation and speculative stories also touch upon present reality in envisioning new ways forward, which is why it is not so difficult as one would think to connect my work as a housing attorney to science fiction. These worlds intermingle every day, especially for marginalized people. Late speculative fiction writer Octavia Butler's 1998 dystopian novel, Parable of the Talents, set in the year 2032, for instance, eerily anticipates Trump's Make America Great slogan, nearly word for word. In my own works of time travel fiction, I highlight the stories of a teen mother, which is really my own story told from a speculative standpoint, the story of a kid who grew up in foster care, the story of a first-generation college student, the story of children caught up in the justice system, and how these everyday, real-world experiences parallel, or better yet, seamlessly blend into science fiction worlds. The sheer weirdness of the societal institutions that we are a part of and how they impact our lives is perfect facts for sci-fi stories. The first story in my book, Recurrence Plot, The Family Circle, is a speculative reimagining of my own history. As I said earlier, my mother had me at the age of 14, and I had my own child at the age of 14. And so it was up to me to become conscious of my own family patterns of teen parenthood and shift that cycle for my child so that they would not repeat it. The language of science and science fiction, again, helps to underscore the fact that reality rivals fiction in its strangeness. Sci-fi also allows me to dig deeper into the meaning of these experiences and how they interact, interconnect with, and follow similar patterns found within various other systems and cycles of nature, such as the cosmos and sociology and psychology. The intersections of science fiction, Afrofuturism, and legal work played a prominent role in the formation of my Community Futures Lab project. Okay. Community Futures Lab was a year-long oral history and what we called Oral Futures Recording Lab and pop-up community resource library, workshop space, and gallery located in the North Philadelphia neighborhood known currently as Sharswood. This area is currently undergoing a multi-million-dollar plus redevelopment project. Longtime homeowners, businesses, and tenants were temporarily and permanently displaced or relocated as the Philadelphia Housing Authority, in partnership with Philadelphia government entities, demolished and blighted deteriorating high-rise and low-rise public housing and executed eminent domain upon 1,300 properties in a very, very small area. So that area that you see highlighted on that map is the area. They took 1,300 properties in and around that area and then demolished the low-income housing that was in that area and displaced 500 families that they claim they'll be bringing back, but that remains to be seen. Community Futures Lab is documenting the redevelopment of the Sharswood neighborhood through an interdisciplinary community art project that explores the intersections of futurism, literature, visual remixing, sound, and activism as art. We think about this project in the context of memory and time. We think about the ways in which recorded social history often undermines personal history, personal experience, and communal memory, particularly if you come from marginalized communities. And so I have a few pictures up here, and I had some audio that had one of the history interviews that we did that kind of talks about some of the background, but I won't be able to play it right now. But just to generally say that the clip that you hear talks about the community. A lot of what you see in the media about this particular community is very disparaging. A lot of it is, you know, this community is poverty-ridden, crime-ridden, and it's essentially as if this community needs to be erased and started over. What you see in the media around conversations is you hear the government and the housing authority saying things like, this is my vision of the future of this community, and you are not hearing the voices of the people who have lived there for decades and who have suffered through the blight and the poverty, but have still made ways and have still created really strong communities with each other. The digital divide further impacts upon the ability of impoverished and marginalized communities to share their own real-time stories and art in a world where mainstream media regularly distorts and misrepresents them. The future has become more than inaccessible. It becomes a threat to families and individuals due to things like big data, increased forms of surveillance, and further widening of the digital divide. The digital divide itself is connected to lower literacy rates in low-income communities, which is itself a reflection of trends in decreased funding for public education, public libraries, public art and cultural activities, and other social services across the country. This is particularly true in the city of Philadelphia, which ranked highest among the top 10 most impoverished big cities in America for several years. In some ways, the trickle-down effects of white flight and urban blight and their twin evil gentrification have caused time to stand still for Philadelphia. In certain areas of the city lie time vortices where the past is superimposed on top of the present. The racism, poverty, and inequality that incited profound emotion and inspired profound genius in people like Sun Ra and John Coltrane in our city remain entrenched in parts of the city. As I said, in Philadelphia was named the poorest major city in the country starting around 2013 and continues into the present to be the poorest major city in the country. And poverty continues to disproportionately impact people of color, single mothers, and children. Compared with a citywide poverty rate of 27%, 31% of African Americans, 41% of Hispanics, half of single mothers, and 1 in 3 children live in poverty. And none of that is by accident. In fact, when the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were signed by its white slave-owning drafters in Philadelphia seeking to secure their future visions of the United States, Black people were not meant to be a part of that vision except as mere commodities. Black bodies, being denied full humanity under the color of law and in the eyes of the country's forefathers, had no stake in humanity's future and had no more agency in that future. Octavia Butler's novel Kindred explores the implications of the inaccessibility of the future to enslaved Africans and the utility and futility of fore and hindsight when traveling along a progressive linear world line. Butler's time-traveling protagonist Dana lands 200 years into her relative past, pulled back by a soon-to-become slave-owning, slave-raping ancestor, whom she must choose to continue to save in order to ensure her own time and bloodline. Sorry, if you can go to the next slide. I'm not going to play the video. There we go. The Dana of Dana's last trip, the protagonist in Kindred, is the bicentennial of the 4th of July. Philadelphia, once the ultimate futurist city of the white male utopian vision, is a city built upon the graves, ghosts, hands, and backs of Blackness, a place where in present day, gentrification and racialized segregation have changed the landscape of Blackness and pushed its memory and its residents to the edges of the city, into temporal spatial ghettos and other vortices or prisons of temporal chaos. Community Futures Lab sat in the midst of such a vortice. In the media, Sharswood has been portrayed as complicit in its own poverty, violence, and without a past or meaningful history or sense of community. Sorry, my slides are out of order. Okay. If you can play that video, thank you. So this is a video that I made of Sharswood when they demolished the low-rise housing and high-rise housing that housed 500 families, low-income families. If it will play. I always find the cheering to be very disturbing. So, Community Futures Lab sought to work with residents of this neighborhood to dismantle that narrative and to allow the community to envision and create its own future and recover and archive its own history through oral history, mapping, and art making. Over the course of a year, Community Futures Lab was located directly in the heart of redevelopment on an avenue once known as a successful business district and with a rich legacy of jazz and art. We used the space as an experimental space safer space for dreaming and envisioning the future, one that was safe and accessible to people living in a community that has been by and large cut off from resources for several decades. It was important to have a space to speculate and imagine alternative futures and to preserve and remember the history of that community when it is going through a process that threatens to erase its past and threatens to strip people of their agency in the future. Community Futures Lab provided the opportunity for community members to participate in a dynamic conversation and critical dialogue around housing and other themes, instead of being passive recipients of information or being confined by stories of their own despair. One of the methodologies that we used in gathering these stories were oral history and what we called oral futures interviews. The oral futures questions were a way of having community members, in a sense, speak into existence and envision what was, would, could, or will be, and creating a record of that. As displaced Africans in America, the story wave does not carry as far as it did on our ancestral lands because of the ways our communities are attacked. We travel in smaller borders, we're in enclosed territories, and memory can be tied to buildings and to land. If we are pushed off that land, the stories disperse. Oral history and what we call here oral futures reclaims this tradition also by deeming art and writing as oral history and as oral futures and other forms of expression as being capable of transmitting those stories. Another one of our methodologies is the quantum time capsule. The quantum time capsule, developed by Black Quantum Futurism Collective, is based on principles of quantum physics and can send messages and objects to any point in the past or future, communicating with both ancestors and future generations. The communal quantum time capsule eludes linear space-time, troubling our notions of past, present, future, history, and progress by including stories and perspectives and objects usually rendered invisible in those realms. Through this quantum time capsule, we explored the everyday ways in which we time travel simply by touching and interacting with everyday household objects. Objects are artifacts of memory and meaning, storing up energy which is neither created nor destroyed in a larger universe. These artifacts of memory tell events as they actually happen, as they have been experienced, while the history that we read about in books are only subjective representations of what historians believe is crucial to remember. Because of a belief that Black people need to be more in touch with our cultural and historical artifacts, we really emphasized everyday objects in our quantum time capsule when having people contribute to the communal quantum time capsule. These artifacts, these puzzle pieces of ourselves and our cultural heritage, are mostly inaccessible, whether they sit in a museum, in a private collection of a wealthy person, have been destroyed, or have yet to be unearthed. Besides thinking about accessibility in the domain of the future, It is really important for us to think about time and temporality itself. Little analyzed are the ways in which time and temporal orientation is connected to class, poverty, oppression, racism, and the legacy of slavery. Use of the presentism time orientation, for example, things like the future is now and living in a moment, can be class and by extension race-based. Presentism has been recently reappropriated by New Age philosophy, yoga, and meditation mantras. However, when a presentism time orientation is applied to Black people and other marginalized people, it's often used negatively, considered as lacking a sense of the future, and only concerned with present pleasures and immediate concerns. It has been associated with laziness, indolence, and lateness. These traits are in turn used to justify the Black community's disproportionate rates of poverty, joblessness, homelessness, disease, and the like. In studies on increased presence of heart disease in African Americans, for example, presentism time orientation is often cited as one of the causal factors. African Americans with a presentism time orientation, in quotes, may not see the need to take preventative medication or to finish antibiotics when symptoms disappear, or, quote, may delay seeing a physician until symptoms are severe and begin interfering with their work or life. And this is from a study of cultural diversity training materials at a nursing school. Often culture-based fears of the hospital and medical institution due to decades of illegal medical experimentation on Blacks, or the inability to afford sustained medical treatment go unconsidered. Again, this presentism orientation, what some people have referred to as CP time, when applied to Black people, is underanalyzed in its connection to slavery, colonialism, and imperialism. Slavery was where time was inculcated into our very skin, where the ring of the bell or the tick of the clock regulated our fate, our labor, our birth, and our death, taking over the natural rhythms and spirits and the spatial temporal orientation and consciousness of our lands, of our ancestral lands. Colored people time has been both a defense mechanism against Black communal trauma and post-trauma under the conditions of class warfare and racial oppression, and a hearkening back to a more natural, ancestral, temporal, spatial consciousness and rhythm. A writer named Jeremy Rifkin explains that the consequence of the linear progress narrative being applied to an oppressed people keeps them confined in a narrow temporal band, unable to anticipate and plan for their own future, powerless to affect their political fate, end quote. For those deprived of access to the future becomes untrustworthy and unpredictable. They become stuck only being able to plan for the present and limited time in the future as the society around them speeds forward in illusory linear progress. This narrow temporal band is used to penalize people on a daily basis. I had a slide about this, but that's okay. I'm just going to talk through it. This narrow temporal band is used to penalize people on a daily basis. In the present day, we continue to be punished for not being on time. For being 10 minutes late to an appointment, for example, you could lose your livelihood, your children, your home, or your freedom. Hierarchies of time and lack of access to the future informs intergenerational poverty in the same way that wealth passes down between generations in traditionally privileged families. Such a narrow temporal band is clearly distinguishable from the sense of presentism or living in a moment that is offered as an option for those tapping into or capitalizing off of so-called New Age techniques appropriated from ancient spiritual practices and spatial temporal orientations. The time dimension plays a crucial and daily role in how people, particularly people of color and poor people, are valued, treated, punished, or underserved by and within the justice system. Such tensions between subjective time and a so-called objective temporality offered by the legal system can again cost one their livelihood, home, children, or freedom. I personally am beginning to focus my work on how time shows up in the legal process and how subjective or communal temporality should be taken into consideration as a part of the decision-making process in the legal system. Thinking through these issues has informed my advocacy work around advocating for long-term protections and other policies that protect the rights of tenants affected by redevelopment, displacement, and gentrification. Also, through the Community Futures Lab, I have been able to broaden my scope of engagement within a community. I was able to meet and introduce myself to service workers in a community while also increasing my engagement as a neighbor and a member of the community, attending monthly community meetings over the past year, and joining the Neighborhood Advisory Subcommittee of the local Sharswood Civic Organization, as well as joining their zoning subcommittee. We will continue to work with these community groups to develop tools in partnership in order to push back against, slow down, or take some control over the rapid gentrification occurring in this area. We are also working with the Civic Association to help leverage key relationships with institutions like the Philadelphia Museum of Art and University of Penn to spur investment and preservation of pre-civil rights artists and activists Doc's Thrash House and Legacy, which is located in the Sharswood neighborhood. We will continue documenting the redevelopment and will create additional iterations of the Community Futures Lab project that will continue to gather oral stories, futures, and histories from North Philly to reshape narratives of histories and futures of this community. Again, the contents of the quantum time capsule will then be created from these artifacts, and stories, and will remain accessible to the community and not locked up in a university somewhere. So ultimately, what my work asks is a bunch of different questions. It asks, how can we control our own time and create new cultural, healthier time orientations? How can we encode new temporal algorithms? What does it mean to dismantle the master's clock, physically, spiritually, psychologically, cognitively? How do we access and take back control of communal memory? How do we begin to map our return to our futures? How do oppressed people conceive of their own future in the face of hostile visions of the future, and when the future was never meant for them? How do we reconcile a temporal fatality offered by the mechanical linear timeline with a belief in the temporal duration of our own radical visions and change? How else can we position progress when we exist within our own spatial temporal environments? And how do we join allegiance with others in spite of that, setting on common visions of the future? I do believe that there is a meaningful way to embrace the paradox of linear time in our own subjective and communal temporalities, allowing these two often opposing temporal modes to coexist in the same way that light coexists both as a wave and a particle on a quantum level. This is done by crafting a unique time construct that takes account of a Western time mode and our own natural time tendencies as described in our DNA through biology, ancestry, culture, spirit, and other natural rhythms. Such a time construct inevitably requires a new language, a new way to speak of the past, the present, and the future without resorting to time hierarchies. Writer Kotwo Ishun notes that by creating temporal complications and anachronistic episodes that disturb the linear time of progress, these futurisms adjust the temporal logics that condemn Black subjects to prehistory, end quote. My collective Black quantum futurism calls for actively engaging temporalities and adopting alternative temporal orientations and frameworks, which in turn help to shift the meaning or placement of the future, as well as shifts the means of access to that future. And I should say futures, plural. To quote Jeremy Rifkin, the new time rebels advocate a radically different approach to temporality, end quote. If one repositions their temporal lens, we can create radical futurities and meaningfully disrupt linear notions of time. Liberation movements like Afrofuturism and Black quantum futurism reappropriate notions of time and temporality itself, stealing back time to actively create a vision of the future for marginalized people who are typically denied access to creative control over the temporal mode known as the future, and redefining that future's relationship to the past and to the present. This involves a reinvestigation and an uncovering of hidden histories, and it involves a hacking into future histories where we have already been erased, and assuring our own appearances, our own existence continuing, even when time has ended on the so-called linear progressive timeline and receded into the so-called inaccessible past. Thank you.
Rasheedah, thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing, and I think you all now know why I said she's one of my absolute heroes and kind of a guiding star for me. We have time to take questions, and there are mics here, there, must be one over there that I can't see. If you'll please make your way to the mics, we're happy to take questions. Catherine, should I be talking about the Wi-Fi now? Okay. There's a Wi-Fi thing, we're working on it.
Good morning. Hi, thank you very much. I appreciated the oral futures. I wondered if you could talk about, if you could give any examples of questions that you ask that really relate to the future.
There are some examples of the oral futures questions that we asked, and we did also traditional oral history questions as well mixed in, but the oral futures was a very specific and intentional process about envisioning the future of that particular community that also drew on the history of that community and what people had before. So like I said, in past years, that community was a very just busy commercial corridor. There was all sorts of shops. It was a place, you know, from hearing from the oral history interviews that we did with people, it was a place where you didn't have to leave the community to do anything because you had everything there. It was also a very amazing sort of jazz and art part of the city where a lot of famous jazz musicians came through and played and things like that. And so in creating and crafting these future questions and thinking about these questions, we also drew on what people had already experienced in that community and what they wanted to see continue or what they wanted to see come back. So it was all sort of interconnected and really looking at oral history and oral futures through the lens of Afrofuturism and what I think Afrofuturism does to time, which is it makes it nonlinear and it kind of creates the cyclical way in which the past and the present and the future can layer on top of each other, and so it's not this strict disconnect between these causal, you know, these states. So.
My question was about the responses to these questions. What did they say? What did the future look like? What did they want to have their vision look like?
So we interviewed about 15 people over the course of the year, and we're continuing to interview people. And one of the things that I learned pretty quickly was that the community was not a monolith, that not everybody wanted to see the same things or wanted the same things to happen. You know, I kind of came in with the mindset that this is crazy, this is bad, they're kicking people out of this community. But some people was like, that's good, I wanted that. I want this, you know, I want to see new things come to this community. There is a lot of violence and crime, but then you had other people who said, no, I want it to stay the same. This is a shame what they're doing. So very, very diverse sort of responses and opinions and you know, that was one thing that I learned, just that not everybody has the same outlook or view of what they want, which is part of the point of this, I think, you know, getting everybody's voice and figuring out how those voices come together to create community and to create something that everybody can be a part of.
So thank you for your talk today. It was really very inspiring. Gentrification is such a sensitive topic. So my question to you, because we're doing a similar gentrification project in Charlotte, North Carolina, and how do you get the community to be a part of the oral history, especially when they're already kind of leery of people coming in their community, wanting to talk about their community, want to have artifacts. So how did you convince the community that you were a trustworthy person to begin to collect those oral histories on their behalf?
So it took a long time, and that's why I was very happy that the project happened over a year. I also didn't mention that I live in a community. I live a couple of blocks from where this is happening, but I'm out of the zone of danger where they did eminent domain on the properties. And I also represent people, so prior to opening the Community Futures Lab, so as I said earlier, I work at a nonprofit called Community Legal Services, and so I represent people all over Philadelphia, and in particular, I was doing some policy work in that community to make sure that people would be able to return after they redeveloped everything. So I already had a sense of, I knew some people, I knew some things, But I came into the project very much, again, thinking that everybody thinks this is bad, this is a terrible thing. So having the lab space open over a year was the smartest thing I could have ever done, because it took at least 6 months to build rapport with community members, for them to stop by the place and know what it was about. We had a lot of questions at first of, who are you working for? Are you working with the Philadelphia Housing Authority? How do you have this space? What are you doing with this space? I actually got funding to do a fellowship from a nonprofit called A Blade of Grass in New York that funds socially engaged art projects. So all the funding came from that, but people didn't know that, of course, and people didn't understand what that meant. So one of the ways that we just tried to build rapport with people was to not place any expectations on people about what they shared, how they shared it. We had multiple ways that you could share oral stories. It wasn't just about recording an actual interview. Sometimes it was just about having a workshop where we all sat down and created art together and talk about housing and map out our favorite places in the neighborhood. Like, we considered that oral history as well. We had a map of the neighborhood itself, where we would have people come in and just map out their favorite places of the neighborhood. Just put a little sticky note and place it on a map, and we have a whole map of that, of places in the neighborhood that people like or had particular experiences with, and consider that to be oral history. So really just being able to expand our notion and meeting people where they were. So not expecting that if somebody came into the lab that they wanted to sit down and do an interview. Maybe they just came in to get housing resources. Maybe they just came in to talk to someone and not necessarily want to record an interview. Whereas some people came in and said, hey, I want to put my story down. Nobody's ever asked me about this. Nobody's ever listened to me, and my concerns about this community. So you had all sorts of just variety of different people. Once we established some of that rapport and trust, and another way that I did that is by having regular hours, so that people would know that we were there for them, and that it wasn't just, we're coming in to extract your stories and leave. Like, we're here to really build with you and make change with you. So I had a lot of interns, because I work full-time still, and I had to go to work every day. So I had a bunch of interns who would staff it during the day, college students and folks, and do the oral histories with people and go out and meet people in the neighborhood. And then we will also do a lot of workshops that were what we called walk-in workshops, where people can just really, again, thinking about this aspect of time and temporality and people's times and people's time and people's ways of understanding things. So we would have workshops where, like writing workshops or things like that, mapping workshops, housing mapping workshops. We did book clubs, but they were set up so that people can walk in at any point, join it, take whatever role they want to take in it, and leave at any point and still be able to get some information from it. So we structured the workshops in that particular way for people to just join and be how they wanted to be with it, or not. So many interesting experiences there. I can't even go into all of them, but like, we would have people, this one man would walk in every couple of weeks and just be like, I hate what's happening around here, and then just walk out. But then he would and he would only do that if we had a workshop, but if like somebody was in there one-on-one, he would come in and just have like really amazing conversations about gentrification and things like that. But he hated, and he also didn't like white people, so every time white people was in a space, what these white people doing here, and then leave. That was amazing. Like, we thought that was amazing that he could come in and sort of be able to express that and be in a safe space where he could talk about things like that and talk about what he sees as gentrification coming into his neighborhood and people taking space. So just experiences like that. And then we also had other people returning and helping us out from the neighborhood. It was a really beautiful thing, and it was challenging and difficult, and I learned a lot about myself and about people and about communities and about my own privileges. Honestly, even though I come from where I come from, I have a job. I have a full-time job. I own my house. I wasn't at risk of losing my house. So it really helped me to understand my privileges and to understand that just because I'm Black and I grew up poor doesn't mean that I know the experience that people are going through or have the same experiences, and that I do have some relative privileges here. So.
I have a two-part question. How do you think that people's relationship with archives would change if we started archiving the future on a mass scale? And also, do you think that archivists within institutions should be doing that sort of thing, or do you think these projects fit squarely within communities alone?
That's a good question. I would need a while to think about what that could look like. I mean, I think it would be amazing if archivists thought about the future in that way, and again, thought about who gets access to the future and how that's interconnected with the past and who gets access to the past and to history, and whose voice gets privileged and all of that, I think it would be amazing to think about that. Sorry, second part of the question was? That's a good question. I think institutions are already archiving the future in the sense that they're creating this, they're like, for example, in Philadelphia and everywhere, I'm sure there's very similar things. There's a plan for each part of the city. There's like this plan that's like North Philly 2045 and Center City 2052, so they're already archiving and creating these futures. And so I think the conversation definitely needs to shift to more community-based archive practices and how people keep in touch with both their futures and their histories. That was something that we thought about very specifically. I'm not an archivist, obviously, by any trade or background, but just thinking about, for me and for other people, how Temple University, for example, a school that I went to, and that's about 10 blocks away from this community, has all of this history about this community that people can't access, and I think that's absolutely ridiculous. I think it's really difficult even for me to access it, and I'm a college-educated person who actually went to that school, and so to get into the archives, I mean, it's not super difficult, but it's difficult enough for people who live down the street that they can't and they don't know about the history of this community, and in that way, the future gets distorted. So, like, one of the things that happened in this community that is rarely talked about when they're talking about how this community came to be blighted and impoverished is that back in 1964, there were race riots in that community that pretty much destroyed the commercial corridor of that community, and it just never recovered from that. And so how that's archived, how people get in touch with that history to understand where they are in the present and understand what is possible in the future and what needs to change for the future to become possible and accessible for all, I think there's we could benefit from having more open archives in that way. And so that's something that we thought about very specifically with this project, and that's the whole idea behind the quantum time capsule, at least, is that history and objects that go into a time capsule, artifacts, they're not just cut off and left for the future. They're open and they're available for people now because time is relative in that sense, and what is the future is relative. And so, yeah, that's how we think about it. I think, yeah, definitely people could benefit from thinking about it in that way more. And I do think that, the institutions have had enough. They're okay. We can have some more community archives now. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your fantastic presentation. I'm Lori. I'm with the University of Florida and the Digital Library of the Caribbean. I'm really interested in the oral history and the questions that you've asked folks. And I was wondering about the role of the environment and event time in the questions. So one of the projects, Dr. Schuyler Esprit set up the first Digital Humanities Center in the Caribbean, Create Caribbean, in Dominica, and she's been working with Unya Kempadu doing different envisionings, ways of seeing what climate change looks like across the world, and specifically also in the Caribbean, and like how do we think about these things with the real already happening? We're already seeing the different disasters, and then with all of the storms, this year in particular, so many of the conversations, like with the University of the Virgin Islands, colleagues checking in, seeing if they're okay, and everyone, the time markers are, it's just like Hugo, it reminds us, and so it's event time. And I was wondering if the questions get to that, and also if we could see all of your questions and then also use them to build across, so, yeah.
So, not specifically did we talk about environmental change in the questions. There's not a very specific question about that. But one of the things that this project has inspired is other oral history projects that are now using oral futures methodology. So there's a organization in Philly called the Chemical Heritage Lab, I think. They are now doing a oral history project on the environment and on climate change, and looking and asking people about climate change in year 2040 in Philly and all of these different things, and specifically reached out to me, and I did the oral history interview with them, but they specifically reached out to me and told me that they were using an oral futures methodology sort of inspired by my project. So I think, yes, that it has been inspired, and people are using that for things like climate change. Another thing that we did over the course of the year project that we had, the community space, was we bought in one of our local state representatives held a environmental mixer and talked about climate change and environment in the Black community and how these things affect the Black community. But again, it's rarely talked about as a thing that is kind of affecting marginalized people in very specific ways. So we did think about it in the project, but it's not something that was specific to these sets of oral history questions. You can find most of them in full online. If you go to, and I can send you the link, but if you go to blackquantumfuturism.com, there's a link, and it's called Time and Memory Survey, and you can actually take some of the survey yourself and answer some of the oral history / oral future questions. It's not all of the questions in full, because there's some questions that are very specific to the neighborhood and the community, but it has some of those general questions. You can find it there.
I see two people standing to, oops, is that off? I see two people standing to ask questions. I think we could have time for both if we're quick, because we've got about maybe 6 more minutes.
Sure. So I really enjoyed your description of how important it was for you to incorporate your creative practice into your legal practice. And I actually feel like there are a lot of similarities between the legal profession and archival profession in terms of kind of complying to certain codes and standards and having this conception of objectivity kind of baked into the idea of the profession itself. So I was wondering if you could give some examples of how your creativity was welcomed into the legal practice. Like, how did you incorporate that? Was that welcomed in your workplace? How do you think that could apply to archivists as well?
Most of it was by force and just by being me, and just, I can't not be me. So I think I naturally just bring this because I do like the Afrofuturist Affair work all the time. That's my night job, basically. And so I'm just doing these things simultaneously, so it's like a natural way in which it has overflow. But my job has been very supportive, actually. I work at a really amazing workplace called Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. They're always thinking about different ways to approach our work. And half of my work is policy work, and so just how you have to think about policy sometimes. Sometimes you have to think outside of the box, or at least we try to as public interest attorneys. But Community Futures Lab was the first way in which concretely I could marry the two worlds of my legal profession and my work, and my Afrofuturistic cultural work, and my job just has been amazingly supportive. Other concrete ways that I've tried to bring it into my work and thinking is, again, in thinking about how time works in things like gentrification, how time works in eminent domain, how time works in when people are being evicted, when they're getting, less than 30 days to move, and what that means for poor people. So just being very specific about the role of time in law and in court and in the legal profession. And also just trying to incorporate that also in my representation of clients. So when I'm telling a client story in front of a judge, really baking in that time element and making that real for people and concrete for people. So that's just some of the ways that I try to do it.
So I was really struck by the way you flipped how you were labeled. You were talking about this the non-traditional student, and just sort of how you flipped many aspects of the narratives that you've encountered in your own life and change that path. So here you're talking about collecting oral histories, right, from this neighborhood, and I'm wondering, I know that there's already been a predetermined path set forth by the urban planners and housing folks, but rather than being a future time capsule, have you thought about ways to incorporate the narrative to influence whatever urban planning is happening at the moment?
Oh, definitely, okay. Definitely. I've used this work to really inform policy work. And one of the things that came out of this was that, so at the same time that this was happening, there's this campaign movement sort of happening around this concept called civil Gideon, which means access to, so just as people in the criminal justice system have access to defense attorneys for free, the same sort of concept for people in the civil world. So pushing for for tenants to have legal representation in court, because one of the things that is really abysmal in Philadelphia is that in landlord-tenant court, we see about 24,000 eviction filings each year. Only 5% of tenants get representation in those hearings, and 81% of landlords get representation in those hearings. So one of the things that I've been trying to do as in my work is to push for expansion of representation of low-income tenants. So while that was happening, while I had the Community Futures Lab open, I was very, very specific about getting people's feedback. We created these things called tenant story forms, where people could write their own, their eviction story, what happened when they got evicted, what they could have used, what they could have needed. And we actually took those stories and gave them out to each council person in their district. And as a result of that, and they also held hearings on the eviction crisis in Philadelphia. As a result of that, one of the things that came out of that was that the city dedicated $500,000 just a couple months ago to lawyers for evicted tenants. So that was one of the very visible, concrete things that I can say very concretely, that people's opinions and stories really contributed and swayed public opinion. And that was something that happened in a very quick time. We did not expect over 9 months for this to become a major issue for the mayor. The mayor also just recently established an eviction task force. And I think very strongly our way of using tenant stories to bring these things to the fore played a part in all of the things happening as quickly as they did. So yes, we did.
Well, we're just out of time, but I would like to invite you to join me in thanking Rasheedah again for this amazing talk.